This week, we welcome Alla Valente and Cody Scott from Forrester Research to discuss the impact of systemic risks on the business. In our second segment, we air two pre-recorded interviews from Code 42 and Direct Defense at RSA Conference 2023. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
Files are the lifeblood of business, and your employees will open the files they need to do their jobs, whether they're safe or not. With Votiro, your employees will only open files that are safe. Votiro applies zero trust principles to files and sanitizes every incoming file for your organization. Known and unknown threats are removed instantly, and the file retains full functionality, so your business is safe and productivity never slows down. And it's not just for email. The Votiro Cloud API works on web downloads, file uploads, cloud apps, FTP, and content collaboration portals. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Votiro. According to the 2022 Data Breach Investigations Report, the human remains the number one driver of breaches today, demonstrating that cybersecurity is no longer just a technical challenge, but a human one as well. But how do you manage the human risks of cybersecurity? It starts with measurement. Only by effectively quantifying human risk can organizations engage employees with relevant activities to truly change human behavior. That's human risk management. Map key human behaviors to the business risks that matter most to your organization for free by visiting securityweekly.com/living security. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 305, recorded May 8th, 2023. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining remotely are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. I hope all is well, sir.
All is well. Just crazy time with work life. And unfortunately, last week I had to jump into incident response mode for clients. So, we know how it is here in the cybersecurity world. But hey, since last time I've been on, crazy in New England sports. I mean, my Patriots got some pretty good draft picks. Christian Gonzalez and Keon White and some others. My Bruins didn't make it past the first round of the playoffs in the NHL, but my Celtics are still alive. So 2-2 right now with the 76ers. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, what was that? Game 5, I think, of the Bruins was just that was a crazy ending. They went into overtime. They lost, and yeah, that was the pivotal game in that whole series.
Absolutely was. Edge of my seat the whole time. It was a great series of games. I mean, Florida's going on and just killing it now. So,
also joining, I think he's back, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
I am back, hopefully with a stable connection here. Hey, how's it going, guys?
Awesome. All right, join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. This series of one-day, invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We are pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you use code SECWEEK23 to register. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. Alla Valente is a senior analyst at Forrester, serving security and risk professionals. She covers governance, risk and compliance, third-party risk management, contract lifecycle management, and supply chain risk, with a special focus on risk management frameworks. Scott Cody is also a senior analyst at Forrester, serving security and risk professionals. He covers cyber risk management with a focus on cyber risk quantification, enterprise risk management, and governance, risk, and compliance. Alla and Cody, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks for having us, Matt.
Yeah.
Now, so Cody, you're new, but Alla's no stranger. I've known, we were reminiscing on the pre-call, Alla, it's been 11,
over a decade.
12 years? It's been over a decade. Yeah.
Let's not tell them exactly how long. That'll age us.
Everybody knows I'm old, so you look great. I'm the old guy, so we're all good. All right, so we're going to talk systemic risk. And as we were preparing for this, I think I want to start with, let's define a systemic risk. Let's just kind of back up a second and go, what is a systemic risk? Let's start there, and then let's look at some of the different systemic risks and the impacts that they will have on organizations throughout the world.
Yeah, happy to start off. So when we think about systemic risks, before they become actual risks, before they materialize, they're these external forces. They're forces that no organization can control whether or not they occur. We can't slow them down necessarily or speed them up. All we can do is identify what they are, be able to evaluate the potential impact that they will have on our business, and hopefully create risk mitigation strategies, some plan Bs and plan Cs, some really good contingencies. And when I talk about these externalities, these external forces, I'm talking about things like geopolitical tensions. I'm talking about climate risk. I'm talking about the speed of innovation. When they occur, they're kind of slower in building, but when they materialize, it really feels like a big bang, and they happen all at once. So, pretty significant in the world today.
Yes, especially over the past 3 to 4 years or so, we've kind of been facing a few of these, right? I mean, put climate change to the side for a second, because I think we've been talking about that one a little longer, but we had the pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, we have interesting tensions between China and Taiwan, and legislation around chips. Like, there's a lot of things going on in the current world right now. So we're facing some of these systemic risks right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, they're not new. They were happening even before 2020. It's just that with the pandemic, obviously one of the top systemic risks, really drawing our attention and changing life globally. That's when I think systemic risks really got on the risk manager's agenda.
So where do these show up in the traditional risk matrix? Are they things we track in the risk register? How do risk managers think about systemic risk on top of like what we would consider traditional risk management, credit risk, business risk, operational risk, security risk, et cetera?
We should think about it as the third pillar of risk management, or if we're thinking about it as a three-legged stool. You have the risk inside of your enterprise, you have the risk to your ecosystem, right? Those are your vendors, suppliers, third-party partners. But this is really just as fundamental to causing or triggering risk to your business, but also to your customers, also to really, business models, operating models, you name it, systemic risks are going to impact that. Now, unfortunately, they're not necessarily tracked in a risk register. They're also not always tracked by risk officers or information security officers. And so unless it is something that we can identify as pertinent to our business and be able to evaluate just the degree of potential risk, chances are we're going to miss it.
Yeah, and the unfortunate side of this too is that they, like Alla said, it's almost completely off the radar, which is part of the problem here. And I think, anecdotally, when we talk about systemic risk, we know that there are problems. We know that they have impacts, like Alla was saying, but it's when you really get into the operational level, the technical level, to think about what those impacts are relative to the work or the business that you have. That's the missing piece. That's the piece that's not on the risk register, but we're really trying to change that.
Yeah. So as folks who have to align budget in order to mitigate some of these risks and put in some levels of resiliency, what do you recommend for executives to be able to weigh these risks and be able to bring a strategy to the executive team, the board of directors, to be able to get investment? Because a lot of times we'll get comments like, well, they're so hard to predict. When's the next time we're going to have a war? And trying to get investments in order to build resiliency is tough around things that you can't really predict or weigh. So what are some recommendations for us to be able to, bring some criticality to these risks and maybe get some investment to help mitigate these risks?
I First and foremost, even just actually including systemic risk analysis in your purview, in your risk management kind of activities, that's a starting piece, because a surprising number of folks don't do that. So if you are concerned about something like, we said, let's put climate change to the side, but if you were to use climate change, for example, or even when you think about the pandemic, lessons learned from looking at how that affected us in the past, looking at the ways that we've seen that kind of proliferate in the day-to-day operations, you can use that as an example to say, okay, well, if we were to model this other type of risk, what would that look like? And can we start to do that? So even just honestly getting started with doing regular assessments, they don't need to be every day, they don't need to be every month, but having them and putting a cadence around when you're going to assess those based on what the kind of perceived impact would be, that's a really effective starting point just to get it in the sort of the leadership conversation and to get it in that vernacular, so that your leadership knows that they can expect to start seeing that. Doesn't solve the budget problem, but it does start putting getting the wheel turning, so to speak.
Yeah. So it starts the conversation, and then from there you can start prioritizing those risks, right? I mean, again, every organization is different. Every organization has a different risk appetite. So, I'm thinking best practices maybe to classify those risks, and, depending on how high the impact or how high the risk is, that would dictate the cadence that you have with the executive team.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, but also fortunately, systemic risks are highly correlated to enterprise risks. So, for example, if you take a systemic risk like the speed of innovation, that might impact your cybersecurity program. It might impact your operational risk program. It might impact your supply chain and other risk domains. So when we start to be able to correlate the systemic risks to enterprise risks, then we can model whether or not that impact is, let's say, low, medium, or high. And then based on that, we would establish that cadence for when we want to do a really good deep dive, but also possibly reassess. So for example, if it's a risk that perhaps based on the context of your business, what your organization, what your customers look like, where your company operates, right? If the impact of a systemic risk on an enterprise risk is low, maybe you want to revisit it once every 3 years. At the same time, if the impact might be high, meaning that there's a much more severe and direct correlation, well, maybe that's something you want to look at annually in your annual risk assessment. So the good thing is, because of that tight correlation, what you're really asking for is budget for enterprise risks, but just understand that those enterprise risks will be triggered and will be impacted by specific systemic risks.
So Alla, when I think about this, when I hear what you guys are saying, and I like the question as Jason raised it, but the challenge I see is, and help me out if I'm seeing this wrong or not, is when I think about risk and I think about how we look at it traditionally, we look at it like impact versus severity, right? And so if I think about the severity of many of these, they could range. You could certainly have lows, mediums, and I would see potentially a lot of highs. There's potentially a lot of high severity if these systemic risks manifest themselves. The challenge is likelihood, right? Like in the traditional way we look at risk, when we think about likelihood, if I think about a pandemic, right? But before we had COVID, we would have said the likelihood of that risk manifesting itself would probably be pretty low. And so the enterprise weighing any importance to that, or saying, we're going to devote resources when we've got all these other things that are at a very high, potentially high severity and potentially higher likelihood. How do you kind of square those two sides, right? I mean, the likelihood of a systemic risk manifesting itself traditionally, I would say, being low. I mean, one could say that sometimes we could look at a high, but the next world war, the next pandemic, the next whatever, very large systemic things. How do you square those two to get the enterprise to do something about that, or should they not just take the best actions that they can given the limited budget? And how to slice that up.
Yeah. Look, risk is now very much a three-dimensional game, right? I mean, you have that probability, that likelihood, you have the impact. But what you also absolutely need to measure is velocity, because it's not a matter of, is this systemic risk going to impact my business? It's how quickly, when that systemic risk materializes, how quickly will I start to feel the after effects? What we need to start thinking about is not only how quickly risks will trigger other risks, but also I guess how broad they will cascade, right? Like that, domino effect. Certainly the pandemic was one of the biggest domino effects that we saw, right? Pandemic, everyone's in lockdown, companies shut down, business services shut down, the world shuts down. Now all of a sudden it's triggering other things. It's triggering finance, it's triggering the economy, it's triggering supply chains, it's triggering, other health and wellness and other conditions and diseases. It's also triggering cyber attacks. It's triggering, bad actors that are using this opportunity to exploit what's happening. So it's not necessarily just about monitoring the probability or likelihood. Chances are when a systemic risk materializes, whether it's in your backyard or halfway across the world, it's a matter of how long will it take based on the interconnectedness of your supply chain, of your value chain. How long is it going to take that systemic risk to flow through the value chain and hit you, squarely, right in the behind? And also, when it does come, will it knock down multiple areas of your business, or can you address it quickly enough where you keep a kind of, sequester to just one area?
Alla, when you were describing the assessment process, hold on one second there, Cody. It reminds me of third-party risk management a little bit, right? Back in the early days when I was doing third-party risk management, we said high risk, we do it every year. Low risk, we do it every 3 years. But that could change, right? And I think the thing with systemic risks that we have to be cognizant of is when there's a trigger event, right? Because you just described something from a velocity perspective that if we're only assessing a systemic risk once a year, but the dynamics change during that year, that's when the velocity piece, I think, is going to catch us off guard and smack us in the behind, right? So it's not only the assessment, but it's also looking for the triggers of when these things are now like in the wild or active is going to be another key measurement that organizations have to stay on top of, isn't it?
Absolutely. Every time you make a business decision, you want to invest, you want a new partner, you want to bring a new product to market. Every business decision, especially those big strategic business decisions, also require you to relook at systemic risks and say, am I more vulnerable to some systemic risks over others, or am I vulnerable to new systemic risks that I didn't have to worry about before, but now they're very much in my backyard?
I'll follow up on that, Alla. So, okay, well, I will take the opportunity to follow up on that. So I think that's, you raise a really interesting point about having, when those trigger events have been, being able to reevaluate that and then aligning that with, I guess, key trigger internal events, right? So if a new product release happens, do we need to reassess, or do we need to look at the changing matrix and say, okay, well, in the last 3 weeks, something has changed, which raises that. So we need to reconsider that product launch. We need to reconsider this expansion. So that's a really interesting, I guess, way to look at it in kind of a matrixed way, to have these different internal and external trigger events that would then constitute kind of recomposing or rethinking about the problem set.
Something I would say, the interesting note about triggers there is really important, I think, from a risk management lifecycle context, because folks who do like change management and configuration management, they're really used to that kind of risk-based thinking of, does this change reach a certain threshold in my environment to trigger some assessment? And really what we're saying is risk management needs to think about systemic risk in the same way. When you think about kind of looking at those triggers or identifying what those are, really you're saying, look, there's a concern, there's something that's happening, it's this category of thing. Do I have an understanding of the relative impacts to my business, to my operations, to my technology, to my data, to my customers, to my employees? Do I understand what those are? And is that, can I monitor it at that level? The piece about triggers that's really important is, again, it lends itself to that idea of continuous monitoring and making sure that you've got a process to do that. And often risk assessment stops at assessment. You assess the risk, you put a lot of effort into getting those, colorful but sometimes useless charts. But at the end of the day, you do this to help a decision. I mean, risk management is a decision support function. And if you need to make sure that you've got kind of clear definitions around what you're looking at, what those impacts are. And then the piece here is not to try and evaluate risk to the nth degree, right? You're never going to be able to model everything, but you should have a general sense of understanding what those impacts would be and what that relative likelihood would be, so that there is some degree of resilience in the planning that you're doing, which is why kind of the concept of business resilience, or even in the IT world, cyber resilience, those things are such important topics right now, because I think the understanding is you're never going to protect yourself against everything, and you shouldn't spend your resources trying to protect against everything, but to prioritize what the most critical things are to you, to your business, to your customers, and then being able to act appropriately with that in a context where it's commensurate with the risk, but also with the supplies that you have to make that happen.
So why do you think that's not happening?
In the report that you guys shared, you guys went through a lot of the higher level risks that we're seeing in organizations today. And one of the things that I loved in the information you shared was kind of that interconnected risk map that you put together of enterprise risk and how it's connected to systemic risk. Can we drive a little bit into some of the risks that you're seeing organizations facing from a systemic perspective? Again, there are a bunch that I love to drive into. I mean, data integrity is a huge one that I was looking at and was very interested in the report out. Speed to innovation, like you had mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Can we drive into some of those top risks that you guys identified?
Absolutely. So when we talk about data integrity, it's not just data accuracy necessarily. It's not also just data security, right? Data feeds all models, both financial and business models. And so even just the slightest change in the data can lead to very different outcomes. I remember this was a couple of years right during the Super Bowl. There was, it hit the news that there was a potential cyber attack on a water treatment plant in Florida. And what they did was they just changed the level of one of the chemicals in the treatment plant. Now, if nobody realized that those levels had changed, because they did change in a way that you wouldn't necessarily notice unless you were looking. I mean, the result of that could have been catastrophic. And that's all we need, right? All we need to do is start moving some, decimal points, changing a 1 to a 0. And now all of these models, I mean, think about hospitals, right? When they're looking at, patient care and diagnoses, you start changing that data. It could really have some significant negative consequences. And so all organizations need to understand not just the models that they have, but also the underlying data that runs those models, make sure that they have, backups, so that if there is some sort of data integrity attack, they can revert back and be able to get back online pretty quickly.
And right now, I mean, data validation is such a huge piece as well. I mean, look at everything that we're dealing with OpenAI and ChatGPT, and everything that I'm telling people is trust but verify, because at the end of it, it's producing what it thinks should be the right response and what it thinks it should be the next word in a sentence, and we're finding that there's issues with the right. So trust but verify, and we're living in that day and age now where we want that information at our fingertips. How valid is that information? And integrity is a core tenet of cybersecurity, data integrity.
And Cody, you were going to talk about speed of innovation.
Yeah. Speed of innovation is the next one that was really out there. It's I spent time in the Marine Corps, and in the report that you showed me, there's the Navy SEALs mantra, which is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? So be careful on how you implement technology, be very thoughtful in how you plan, and then, make sure that you're doing it in a systemic way. Even on the cybersecurity and technology side, we have issues with adoption of technology because it's implemented so fast that the end users can't even get to adopt the technology. Talk to me a little bit about that speed of innovation when it comes to creating risk.
Yeah, the OpenAI example is a really good one, but that it's also just a really easy one because it's so tangible for us right now. We're living and dealing with this. Especially, there's a lot of articles coming out about the privacy issues around it, actions that folks are taking. There's the concern about putting in business data and customer data, and where that data is going, where it's residing, how it's being secured. It does actually touch and is related to the data integrity issue in a way, just because of that. But when you think about kind of generative AI and large language models, that validation mechanism is so important for a ton of different reasons why. But really, when we think about it from the risk context, again, it's this overarching question of, do I know where the data is going? Do I know who's touching this? Who can look at this information? And ultimately, how is it being used? So when we talk about speed of innovation, it's really interesting there because really it begs the question, was that full life cycle thought of? So bringing it back to that example of ChatGPT with the data, do I know where that's going to live, where it's going to reside, and how it's going to be used? In a normal sort of data management from a traditional security approach, we would say that there needs to be all kinds of documented agreements. There needs to be kind of network diagrams. I need to have controls in place. And that's just for the data side. But when we're talking about, rushing these new products that are, trained and supposed to manipulate data in different ways, it really invites a whole host of new integrity issues that I don't know enough people are actually looking at. So it really begs that question, what controls do I have in place? And are they sufficient? And do I have a way of knowing if those controls are sufficient?
Right.
Which be on the risk remediation side, but it goes back to that sort of continuous monitoring thing that I talked about before.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that speed to innovation happening through the pandemic too, and right now we're trying to shore up some of that risk because so many organizations, the knee-jerk reaction was let's move to the cloud so we can get everyone remote, and let's start bringing these technologies online as fast as we possibly can. Now we're starting to see the after effect of that, and that's kind of that interconnected risk chain, right? Pandemic happens, affects all of our businesses. There's a rush to take on the technology, the most innovative technology out there. And now we're seeing some of the risks, come to light. Now we're going back and trying to secure all of those tenants and secure all of those cloud applications.
Yeah. Never time to do it right, always time to do it over.
Right. That's right.
Well, a really good example too, like Alla and I were talking about this just a couple of weeks ago, but when you think about Zoom, for example, like how Zoom was adopted and used so much, like at the start of the pandemic, what was the big issue that happened? Well, Zoom bombing, that became a whole thing. It had a whole label. It was its own sort of systemic problem across different universities and businesses who were getting in there because you had folks coming in, uploading obscene or bad, images or content, malicious links, things like that. And it caused a change in the business model, which again, speed of innovation, that's exactly what it is. It's that after, recognizing the problem after the fact and trying to address it, but it was that speed to bring it to market first and foremost that drove that delivery.
Yeah, we were seeing a lot of that with public sector meetings, whether it be local government, state governments, school districts, trying to get their meetings online, trying to get their public back engaged into the government side of the aisle, and then you'd have Zoom bombing in the middle of a school committee meeting or something like that.
Exactly. New York City actually banned the use of Zoom for virtual education.
Yeah. Yeah, it was adoption of that technology and not securing it down. One of the interesting pieces that I had pulled out of the information you had shared with us is, a systemic risk now is the rise of employee power. And that organizations need to focus on employee experience. I pull that out as such an important risk because if you can't maintain employee satisfaction, you're going to have a very difficult time having client satisfaction and being able to move the needle there. That was such a great risk that you put out there that I think a lot of organizations need to make sure that's highly prioritized is employee experience. Talk a little bit about how you dug into that and what brought those findings about.
Yeah. So the rise of employee power is actually similar, but a bit adjacent to the rise of values-based consumers, right? When the pandemic was when the pandemic first hit and resilience was key, just maintaining enough headcount to be able to operate was just so critical. And, we saw this rise of employee power where not only were employees kind of dictating the terms, but also letting employers know what was acceptable and what wasn't. The interesting thing about employee power as a systemic risk, and it's something else that we write a lot about, which is that one systemic risk can very easily trigger another and then a third and a fourth. So, take, for example, something like geopolitical tensions, right? Or maybe even climate risk, even though it's not the new and shiny anymore. When you have employees that fundamentally disagree with how their companies or how their businesses, but also, how the companies they do business with are either taking a stance on those issues or not taking a stance, now all of a sudden you have this empowered employee that could either they can choose to quit, they can choose to remain, but kind of you won't get the same level of productivity. Or really, I guess, on the extreme side, you might even see insider risk becoming,
right,
an option because there's just that power that exists and, not enough is being done according to those employees.
Yeah, and we're seeing a ton of that on the environmental, social, and governance side, right? Where even through third-party vendor risk management, you have other organizations coming to you and say, show me what you're doing and how you're making sure that you're focused on ESG. And then, that's in front of your employee base, right? Where they know and they're thinking about that. Your consumers are thinking about how they do business with you. So
Absolutely.
that focus on ESG and then that focus on employee experience, those are just two great risks that I think a lot of organizations really need to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, we did a risk survey last year, and the report isn't out yet. But one of the top ways that all organizations measure the success of their enterprise risk efforts is really the effect that it has on customer experience. So when customer experience is high, when customers are satisfied, that's how they know that their enterprise risk efforts are working. And that's kind of new because it used to be all about, well, risk is just to keep bad things from happening. Now we're talking about how do we use risk as really that differentiator, as that advantage to help us grow and help us acquire more customers, grow revenue, do all of these great things that, we have in our strategy.
Yeah. And I mean, this is what we talk about on the show all the time. How do we make security and risk and compliance a differentiator to the business, right? And it's taking the cybersecurity leaders and boosting us up at that executive level where we can start having the business conversation, and being able to speak to systemic risks like this is extremely important for us to be able to influence out to the executive leadership team and to the board of directors. If we're speaking this language as cyber leaders, we're speaking the language of the business.
Yep.
Risk is the language of the business.
Yes, it is. I even said this in my presentation last week. Security is a risk management discipline. We all better get on board because that's what we're going to see. And I identified another systemic risk, by the way. The internet, when you live in the rural environment, is a systemic risk. There's nothing I can do about it. It's an external force.
Especially as a podcast host.
So actually, that is a systemic risk. And it's called concentration risk, where when you live in rural areas, your access is limited to just a couple of providers or maybe just one provider. So, if you're overly concentrated and something goes wrong, well, disaster ensues.
Yes, well, it just did. And I think my co-hosts for keeping us on track, Alla and Cody, thank you so much for joining us on Business Weekly, Business Security Weekly. We just love the conversation.
Thanks,
so
guys.
much.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to take a quick break and then air 2 pre-recorded interviews from RSA Conference 2023. Stay tuned.